everybody. Thanks for your time this afternoon. My name is Chris Duffield with Newline Mortgage, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Before we do get started, can I get everyone to make sure your doors are shut and your other devices are turned off? I'm going to cover quite a bit of information in a short period of time, so I need your full attention. Also, everyone on this call will receive a copy of the training and the material at the end of the broadcast. Again, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Chris Duffield. I'm an account executive for Newline Mortgage. And for about the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about issuing a pre-approval and using LP as part of that process for your VA purchase loans. We're also going to review a documentation checklist created to help you recognize and track when we need documentation from your borrower. And the goal of this training is to get you familiar or comfortable with issuing a pre-approval that will stick. Also, before we get started, I would like to take a moment and ask you for your business. As an AE, I'm paid commission, so the best compliment you can give me is to send me a loan. If you find this training useful and learn something new, please send me a loan on any product. Newline does offer some great FHA, VA, conventional, and USDA pricing right now. We also have many other trainings available on all of these products. So, okay, let's get started. You guys should be reviewing material with me. You should be able to see that on your screens. Like I said, this training will help you with your loan pre-approval and with creating a final list of required documents from your borrower. We're going to cover the LP findings review, and we're also going to cover the borrower documentation requirements. This is part of a series of trainings that I'm putting together, or I've put together for VA purchase loans. Up until this training, you've been given enough information, if you've completed the series of trainings up until now, to take a complete application, asking all the right questions and formulating your loan scenario. It's important to make sure you've asked all the right questions, as your pre-approval is only as good as the data you've gathered and the documentation that supports it. So if you haven't listened or attended to the trainings that have led to this one, you may want to go back and do that. There's a lot of information that we've covered to get us to this point. An important part of the pre-approval process is to run your LP. With an LP approval, you can issue a pre-approval based on receiving the supporting documentation from your borrower. The LP approval is great to help determine if the borrower's ratios will be approved and or if the credit history will be approved. One of the common misconceptions about LP is that it will give a list of the documentation needed to get a loan approved. However, LP only gives a partial list. In the LP approval itself, it requires the lender to provide representation and warrants that state the loan meets Freddie Mac guidelines, but does not give specific documentation requirements. It does list some documentation requirements, but not a full list. Also, lender documentation requirements can vary, and you'll want to confirm what the lender's documentation requirements are in comparison to what LP's documentation requirements are. Please know this is not a full class on LP. We're only going to cover the information necessary and most typically used to process your VA purchase loans. If you're interested in additional information about LP, there's a link here in this training that you can click on and go get more LP training. If you're interested in learning how to run LP in our system, I do have a separate training for that. Please contact me and I'll set you up with our Newline How to Run LP training. Okay, so LP, when you run it through their system, you're going to receive a full feedback certificate. It has the results, the credit information, and loan information used to achieve the results. It also gives loan processing instructions, credit warranties, and documentation guidelines. Please know that Newline can only work with an accept rating. So we don't manually underwrite files. You do have to have a full LP approval in order to send a file to us. So I'm going to go ahead and open an example of the LP findings and what I'm referring to. This is a live sample, And this is what it looks like after you run LP. You've got your Loan Prospector full feedback certificate. You've got your results up here. In this case, we've got an accept rating. And then this information is followed up by your credit report information. And you've got your loan information here. This is important to review. You want to make sure that LP reviewed your loan correctly and the way you submitted it. You'll notice here that you can run LP on a TBD property. This is the only way to actually get a pre-approval decision on a loan because Newline needs an actual property address so that we can issue a TIL. And then our underwriters are able to take a look and underwrite your file and give you a full decision. So without a property address, LP or any AUS system actually is your best bet for pre-approval. And then, of course, like I stated earlier, make sure that you review the loan terms so that you can see the loan was underwritten according to the terms you submitted it. So you'll want to run through everything in this section. And you've got some transaction information, some some loan processing information. Basically, again, this just really runs through some of the expectations LP has, or Freddie Mac rather, things you have to do during the loan process. Obviously, if you submit, like for example, I'm not going to run through every single thing here, but for example, it's pointing out that you've underwritten this file. It's underwritten this file based on having $36,878 in reserves. It's letting us know that because that means we have to document that in our file. So, I would definitely go through and take a look at this information, see if there's anything that you have any questions on. You've got the applicable credit warranties and waivers. This is mostly for lenders. You've got documentation guidelines. You've got employment information. And under employment information, it starts to give basically documentation requirements. But this is not the be-all, end-all of your documentation requirements at all. I mean, you'll notice just in the example that I used previously where, it said that it used about $36,000 in reserves, you'll notice it's not really asking here that we document that. So it gives you some documentation requirements, and you'll want to review it, even though we do have our own documentation requirements. The one exception to that is tax returns. If LP only requires 1 year's tax returns, then Newline will only require 1 year's tax returns. Outside of that, literally for every other piece of documentation, we've got our own requirements. I mean, you'll notice in here it doesn't necessarily, tell you that you have to have, document the sales price and things like that. I mean, it does say this in a roundabout way. But really, most of this feedback certificate is for the lender use. You're not going to pull out a lot of information from this. Honestly, the thing for LP is that it gives you the warm and fuzzy on your ratios, if you're working with high ratios. In this scenario, we have slightly high housing ratio. Totally something LP is working with. It approved that. We had pretty high FICOs on this borrower, so it really wasn't an issue for credit. This was, definitely just kind of a warm and fuzzy approval. But if you have higher ratios or more marginal credit, you definitely run LP and get the warm and fuzzy. And then you are more than welcome to forward these LP findings on with other supporting documentation if you end up having a specific question on the file. Our underwriters can take a look and give you feedback on specific scenarios and specific questions. They just can't underwrite a file and actually issue an approval or a denial in our system where it's trackable by our investors. They can't do any of that unless we can issue our TIL, and of course, as per RESPA, we can't issue our TIL until we have a property address. So there you have that. So where to go for your documentation requirements? One place you can go is through Osmosis and your experience, and you can draw from that and certainly create a list, use whatever process you use to put together your documentation requirements. I am a fan of tools and lists and checklists, and so what I've put together, and this is an ongoing project, is I've got this documentation checklist, and I created it so that you can mark here what's required as far as documentation, and then over here you can mark if that document has been received or not. And this checklist covers a good part of the mortgage and all of the possible documentation requirements. Like I said, it's ongoing. Sometimes I do find additional documents that I like to add to this checklist. So you can always check in with me to get the latest documentation checklist. You'll notice it started out with disclosures. So all the VA disclosures, they're always all required. So, you know, all those boxes would have been checked, and then you can mark if those are received or not. But then you get into like the 1003. The 1003 is a great point of reference for QC. I would use the 1003 and make sure you're checking that against this is your addendum to the 1003, your VA addendum. You know, making sure that the address and the borrower's name match. You've got this addendum signed by the LO. I would use the 1003 to match against the first 2 pages of your tax returns. Make sure the address matches and the names match. And if there's any Schedule A expenses for unreimbursed employee expenses, because if there are, you're going to need a full set of tax returns. Also, I would use the 1003 as a point of reference to match the name of your borrower throughout the file, to make sure the subject property address matches throughout the file, and to make sure that the borrower's current address matches throughout the file. And then you've got the processing. So some things a processor needs to put together in conjunction with the borrower, you know, is putting together that certificate of eligibility, perhaps a change of circumstances required if the loan terms have changed from the initial loan application. So what I mean by that is perhaps you've taken an initial application and you've disclosed on it, and between the time you took your application and the time you submitted the loan to Newline, you've changed some of the loan terms or you've even locked the loan, then we need a change of circumstance at that point. Photo ID requirements, you know, double check permanent, non-permanent, resident, alien documentation. Make sure to complete Newline's loan participant submission form, the 4506T, the Social Security authorization, the VA case number assignment. All those things need to be completed by processing prior to submitting the loan. Okay, and then I broke the rest of this out into different categories. So right here, or starting with this category, I've got credit. So you can run through and use this to help make sure that you're reviewing not only the documentation and what's required, but reviewing the documentation itself and what's required inside of the documentation. So, for example, on the credit report, you'll definitely want to cross-reference that with the 1003 to make sure that all of your liabilities are accounted for. You know, making sure the credit report history, or excuse me, the credit history meets the guidelines and that liabilities meet the guidelines. If you need a mortgage rating, maybe because it's not on the credit report for whatever reason, you'll need a copy of the note, and you'll need 12 months canceled checks with no lates. If you noticed on your 1003 or on your credit report that the borrower has perhaps been late on student loans, which is considered a federal debt, You may want us to check CABRs in advance to see if there's an issue. That has come up in the past. Had some borrowers default on a student loan and they failed CABRs, and we didn't find that out actually until the end of the loan process. So use this worksheet because it will actually help you catch things at the beginning of the process that you'll catch at some point, but it's best to run through the documentation checklist and get everything you possibly can up front and ask for everything up front. Just because your pre-approval is only as good as the data and the supporting documentation. If the supporting documentation starts coming in and it's not supporting the data, that of course is going to have an effect on your pre-approval. When you're looking at bankruptcy papers, you want to check and make sure the borrower's name matches the credit report in the 1003, that you've got a complete set of all the schedules, that you've reviewed the Schedule A, which is the list of debtors, and check things like the debtors match their credit explanation. So if they say the BK was medical related, do you see a lot of medical bills on the bankruptcy papers? Our underwriters take a look at things like that. And that, if there's a mortgage included in the BK, it has to be reaffirmed. You want to make sure you get a copy of the discharge with that BK, and the BK has to be signed by the judge. So that's kind of an example of how to use this documentation checklist. Also goes through, I've put the divorce decree under credit. If there's co-signed debt, you've got documentation requirements there. If we need to use alternative credit for whatever reason, we've got documentation requirements there. If they're paying a collection or a charge-off judgment or a tax lien off, you've got documentation requirements there, letters of explanation, credit card, mortgage statements, foreclosure, deed in lieu of foreclosure, and short sale. I've outlined all the documentation requirements there. And then I've outlined documentation requirements for employment as well. I outlined documentation requirements for income, and of course, for each document, I put the requirement, what you should be looking for in each document. So for example, on pay stubs, first of all, we must always have the most recent 30 days. It must have the name of the employer, the borrower, and the pay period dates. It must have year-to-date earnings. It cannot be handwritten. And you want to review it for undisclosed debt, like for repayment of a 401k or garnishment, because those things obviously could be added back into your DTI and have a huge effect on your loan. W-2 requirements, what you need if we're using overtime bonus commission income, written VOE requirements, self-employed commission, you're going to need tax returns. I've outlined the documentation there for both personal tax returns and business tax returns. If you need a CPA letter, what's required if employed by a relative or any other interested third party. Rental agreements, or excuse me, rental income, what you may need, or rental property, what you may need for that. What's needed for Social Security and retirement, child support, alimony. And you'll notice I've left a section called Other if you need to add your own. So if you want to keep track of documentation that's not on this list, I've kind of tried to create a space for that as well. I put together documentation requirements for liabilities, evidence of student loans deferred, lease agreements, the HOA fee, credit card, mortgage statements, payoff debt, other. Giving you documentation requirements for assets, so for your bank statements, when they're needed and why. Source of your earnest money deposit. The documentation requirements for that, documentation requirements for your gift, your sale of stock, sale of an asset. And then under collateral, I've put documentation requirements for your purchase contract, your appraisal, and for your inspections, and for your title report. So it's a pretty comprehensive list. And I'll just say it one more time, email me always for an updated copy of that in case I have added to it. So basically, in a nutshell, up to this point, we've talked about, taking an application, taking a complete application, pre-qualifying your borrower, make sure they meet, VA's basic underwriting guidelines, asking those questions that are not on the 1003, really putting together, analyzing their credit report, putting together a real comprehensive scenario, know exactly what you're looking at. You've got all the questions answered so that you have a solid 1003 and that you can document the data. And, you've input that data into LP, ran your LP, got your approval. And now basically with your pre-approval, you should be able to go back and give your borrower a complete list of all the documentation requirements. And, this is just a real slick process. If you can get this process down so that you're only asking your borrowers once, maybe twice at the most for documentation, you're going to look like a hero to your borrowers and to your real estate agents. The complete list, just gives everybody, because there's a deadline. Of course, you have your settlement deadline, which you need to backtrack. Settlement deadline is your closing deadline. You need to backtrack from that closing deadline all the way back to, well, when do I need to submit that loan to my lender to meet my closing deadline? Well, before that, when do I need all my documents from my borrower so that I can submit a complete loan to my lender? So you just need to be systematized, is what it's about. And if you know a by when date to get your documents, from your borrower to your lender, and you give your borrower a complete list and you keep track of that, it makes everybody's job easier. You'll meet that date. It's easy to update your borrowers and your realtors because everybody knows exactly what's needed and when it's needed by. And if we don't have everything we need by the date we need it, that should be a red flag for everybody. It should be a red flag for your borrowers. It should be a red flag for your realtors that, hey, we may not meet our closing date, if we don't have all this documentation. So that puts you in the driver's seat. This is about having a process, controlling the process, putting you in the driver's seat, and empowering you to be in control of the loan and making sure you're meeting these very important deadlines. So up to this point, that's hopefully where you're at in this training curriculum that I've put together. At this point, I'm hoping you feel good about pre-qualifying your borrower and gathering and asking all the questions that you need to make a good pre-qualification that sticks. So that is it for this afternoon's training. Remember, I'm only a phone call away. And again, if you found my training useful, please send me a loan. My name is Chris Duffield. I'm at 801-759-8521, or you can email me at kduffield@nlmtg.com. Please contact me for any questions or if you need any additional training on VA purchase or any of our other products. Thanks and have a great day.